Thank you, Russ. If someone could bring me the questions, I'd appreciate it. You know, it might be worth mentioning to you that currently there are about 27% of the American people who now reside in a state where our initiatives have passed or there is an executive order that has been signed in the case of Florida, or where the legislature has taken action to outlaw preferences. Now that might not seem like a lot to you, but it really is. And so much so that I think if you were to search the web on this issue, you will find more articles that talk about affirmative action coming to an end, written mainly by those who are on the other side of our issue. But I think that California and Arizona and Michigan and Nebraska and Oklahoma, those states have sort of created this paradigm in which most people believe that affirmative action is coming to an end. And I think it is. I think we are one Supreme Court away from closing this baby out with regard to higher education. Now, that doesn't mean that the ball game's over, because the mindset is still there that there are victims and there are oppressors and there is institutional racism, and our president has really more deeply embedded identity politics into the fabric of American life than before. And as a result of that, we're living, I believe, in a more race-conscious society than we did 5 years ago. And until we can change that, so that Americans see themselves as individuals and merit triumphs over diversity, we cannot proclaim that that victory has been obtained. So, questions. Let's take a couple. Our dear friend Gail Harriott has to make a hasty exit for a plane, but let's look at some of the questions. Does the failure of affirmative action actually fuel the demand for even more affirmative action? Gail?
That's exactly what's happening at the University of Texas. They argue we need to have more in the way of racial preferences because we need to have diversity and critical mass in every major. And what they don't understand is the more they give preferences, the harder it's going to be for them to have critical mass in science and engineering. The two things are just working against each other.
Can one infer from the recent oral arguments in the Supreme Court in the voting rights case how the court might rule in the Fisher case? Any thoughts?
It'd be better to look at the Fisher case to see what the oral argument was like in the Fisher case. I attended the oral argument in the Fisher case, and I was kind of underwhelmed. It seemed to me that the justices were not overly, that they hadn't read all the briefs yet. They didn't really seem to be that into it, which worries me a little bit, but not too much. I've clerked for the Illinois Supreme Court many, many, many years ago, and my recollection was it was not all that uncommon for opinions to be formed after all the briefs are completely read, which could not have happened with all the amicus briefs in this case. And an oral argument is a whole lot less important than the media would lead you to believe. So I am optimistic about the Fisher case. I believe it is very, very likely that Ms. Fisher will win her case. The only thing I'm concerned about is, will it be a small win or a big win? And I think it's more likely we're going to see a small win than a big win. We'll see. But I'm optimistic that the outcome will be positive for Ms. Fisher.
I have just been advised that we can go until 5:40 on Q&A, and then the reception will be on the third floor at 5:45. Where do we see tribal rage in response to the In response to anti-discrimination laws, the questioner observes that the American people have been amazingly tolerant.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of suppressed rage because people don't want to be called racist. In fact, I argue that current racial suppression policy is predicated more on what I call R-word dread. Whites fearful of being called racist than on any rational accounting of the pluses and minuses of cost and benefits. But I think that there is clearly that suppressed rage. And I think if you look, internationally, where people are more likely, in India, for instance, to give expression to their feelings, you see very much unsuppressed rage. But I definitely think that there is a huge degree of actual hostility. It's something that people who are against racial preferences are usually against them very passionately. You can see that in polls, or just talking to people, even though, as I say, they tend in many cases to be intimidated because of loss of stature in their jobs or in universities or so on. But even speaking to people on the left, I speak to, most of the people you get at a place like Princeton are going to have at least center-left views. And I see even people on the center-left who would never say, I'm against affirmative action. If you talk to them, you can see there's a certain hostility to, there's just something they see as wrong with racial preferences, and it's something that it comes out if you pick up the subtle cues.
Thank you, Russ. The discussion about tribalism prompts me to comment on something that's going on in California. I recall during the 2009 campaign that Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, now of Los Angeles, whispered to me when we were at a regents meeting that someday there would be a Latino majority in California, and that 209 could be overturned when that happened. And that, if not the overturning, at least the challenge is coming to pass. The Latino caucus is the dominant part of the Democrat Party in California, and thus they are the dominant component of the California legislature. They vote as a bloc, about 35 members strong, but it's no coincidence that the last few speakers have had last names of Perez and Bustamante and Villaraigosa because they vote as a bloc. I don't care whether all speakers are vegetarians, as long as they vote not on the basis of their ethnic identity, but vote for whatever they believe to be right. There is a bill in the legislature now, a constitutional amendment, that would extricate public education from the commands of Proposition 209. And that bill, which was not a constitutional amendment in the past, but the bill to do that was vetoed twice by Schwarzenegger and was vetoed more recently by Governor Brown. Taking it back to the people, as this bill would do, as this constitutional amendment would do, raises some interesting questions about the changing demographics of our country. I'm reluctant to make a prognosis about what will happen with a new campaign, but it's almost certain that we're going to have one to amend the Constitution by eliminating public education from the three components of Proposition 209.
I think, add to that, I think what you may well see is a growth of white nationalism. With my friend Carol Swain, who at the time was the only black professor at Princeton, we did a book on the growth of white nationalism. And it's a marginal force right now, but if I had to predict, I would not be surprised if it's on the upswing, where white people are going to say, hey, if it's okay for Latinos to think of themselves as Latinos and vote that for their interests, and blacks to think of themselves as blacks and vote for their interests, why can't we white people think of ourselves as an ethnic group and vote for our interests?
Well, I'm very fearful of this changing demographics. There is a strong history of whites who don't get together every Monday morning and say, here's what we're going to do, you know, but there's a strong history of whites being very sensitive to the interest of, quote, minorities, a term that I hate. I don't sense that sensitivity among the emerging Latino majority in California. And there's an attitude that's sort of reminiscent of the NAACP and blacks back in the late 1960s, that the only way to build the Latino middle class in California, for example, is to use affirmative action. That argument was stated to me on more than one occasion by those who were in the Latino, Hispanic upper crust in California. And I think that put before them, they might very well prevail in getting this constitutional amendment passed. That's why Fisher becomes very important. To solidify the changes that have been made in our state of California. Can anything be done about racial preferences in faculty appointments, promotions, and tenure?
No.
I'll say this. There actually isn't as, I shouldn't say that. I'm talking mainly about sort of the high-end institutions like Princeton. There's very, I mean, they would never accept as low a proportion of people in the undergraduate classes, the lower portion of black or Hispanic, as they have in the faculty. I mean, in faculties at elite universities, sometimes the black representation is no more than like 3% or so. I mean, and they would never accept 3% as an entering, proportion of undergraduates here. They do seem to, they won't reach down as far, put it this way, for faculty appointments, is my experience, as they will for undergraduates. And Lisa has shown just how much the huge, enormous plus factor that accrues to you if you check off black and, to a lesser extent, Latino.
Let me add a little bit about a lawyer's perspective. When I said no, what I was thinking is very, very difficult to mount a lawsuit on that basis, not just because most, though not all, sometimes university faculties are silly enough to say things they shouldn't be saying. But, it's also the fact that the individual who might bring the lawsuit is, working within a small academic community. If you're an aspiring law professor or an aspiring professor of art history, you don't want a reputation as a troublemaker, as the one who brought the lawsuit. And that makes it very, very difficult for lawyers to find a potential plaintiff that they can undertake a representation for. So I think it's very, very hard to deal with this problem.
The universities, though, I'll say, generally require a PhD to get most university, and there's just such a paucity of PhDs among blacks and Latinos that for that reason you tend to get a much lower proportion of black and Latino on faculty than you will at the undergraduate or graduate level, for that matter. They do stick to the meritocratic ideal when it comes to the credential of the PhD. That's my experience anyway. They usually won't, take some, maybe, again, I'm thinking mainly at the higher end, maybe at the community colleges it's different, but I know at the higher end schools, they won't take anybody who isn't on the way to completing a PhD. And there's just so few black and Latinos in certain fields, in many fields, that for that reason, they don't have all that many on faculties.
One questioner writes, I have doubts that there ever was support, wide support, for a colorblind standard. One form of race preferences simply replaced another. What makes the colorblind argument more persuasive now than before? Well, let me just take a crack at this, and then we'll open up to others. I think that coming out of the 60s, my own view is that while the colorblind standard might not have enjoyed wide support, I think that clearly there was a national consensus of colorblindness. That's why we honor Martin Luther King, who was not a hero during his life, but thereafter, Americans, every February and on his birthday, the American people kind of rejoice in this colorblind ethic, this colorblind notion. And over the years, there has been a battle, and this really goes to the heart of what the battle over race preferences is about. Will there be merit and colorblindness, or will there be diversity? And the diversity rationale has been winning. It's very difficult, in my opinion, to argue forcefully against diversity, even though it's one of the most insidious things around. And it's the antithesis of merit, it's the antithesis of a colorblind approach. But until we can take on the diversity rationale, we won't win this battle against race preferences.
Can I say, I've debated this many times, and I found it very effective to say this right off, there are good and bad diversities. And a diversity that's stigma reinforcing is a bad diversity. A diversity that's what I call downwardly rating, a diversity that is purchased at the expense of denying diversity to a lower ranking school. In other words, one school's diversity gain is usually another school's diversity loss. So Princeton takes students who might be going to Lehigh. Lehigh takes students who might be going to Penn State. Penn State takes students who might be going to a school beneath them. So you have the zero-sum question, and you have the emergence of bad diversity. It's just bad if you put people who are of different intellectual abilities or different levels of academic preparation or academic achievement together on the same campus, because it leads to the mismatch problems which have been discussed here and in Sanders and Taylor's book is taken up so well. You have the question of stigma reinforcement. It just reinforces the view that the underrepresented minorities are less intelligent, less capable, and there's already that idea out there. So it reinforces the stigma that exists in a very powerful way. And I find mentioning that to audiences, the other side has virtually no response to that. They realize there is a stigma reinforcement problem, that what I call upward ratcheting. We have an upward ratcheting system where if you check off black, you're going to be upwardly ratcheted into a school that's 1 or 2 or 3 levels of selectivity beyond where you would have gotten into. If you check off Asian, you're going to get lower. You're not going to be accorded any kind of preference. Indeed, it's going to be harder for you than a white person. So I say, what are you achieving by diversity? If one school's diversity gain is another diversity loss, if there are good diversities and bad diversities, and if it's not good to put students together on the same campus who are of different levels of academic achievement, what have you achieved here? And as I say, I've talked in many venues, and the other side has virtually no answer to these claims and objections.
Why do we care about whether the person seated next to you is white, black, purple, or whatever? If we believe as a society in the principle of equality of every individual, and that people are not proxies for some race, it may not be politically correct to say what I'm saying, but why in the hell do we care about race? What's the point? My own view is that it just shouldn't matter, and that the ultimate objective in our nation should be to disregard it. This is what tears up neighborhoods in many cases. People want to live in a community, it is argued, that is more homogeneous. And so when a black family moves in at a certain level, whites will move out. And it's the argument that you're breaking up the neighborhood or whatever. Same thing is happening in college with the diversity argument. We're so preoccupied with whether there are 10% or 11% blacks and Hispanics that everything else is sort of put aside to achieve this so-called diversity. Yet you go into classrooms and or go into the cafeteria and blacks are seated alone or whatever. So why do we care? Why do we spend so much time on diversity? I think that it's better to say that we're individuals and it really doesn't matter. I just think that this whole diversity rationale is changing the character of the nation and leading us into a cul-de-sac that, in terms of constitutional principles, we could never win. Because the colleges will say, we don't have enough. And you go into Berkeley, and believe me, if you're looking at diversity as on the basis of race and ethnicity, you've got diversity coming out the yang-yang. But they don't have enough black people. And that's the measurement of diversity at Berkeley. How many black people are there?
I was going to say, I should mention Gordon Allport. There was a famous book written in the 1950s by Gordon Allport where he put forth what's called the contact hypothesis. And he says that you can break down prejudices by getting people to learn about other people, but only if, and he made several criteria, and one of the ones is that they have to be equal status. In no place in America did white people have more interaction with black people than in the Mississippi Delta, and in no place were they more prejudiced, because it was sort of, an owner of a large farm and his sharecropper, or a wealthy white woman and her black maid. They weren't of equal status. And for contact to overcome a prejudice and discrimination, Allport said, people have to be of equal status. For instance, if you have a neighborhood and you have people who, let's say, professionals in the neighborhood, and a professional black moves in, that's going to be a good thing. If a black truck driver moves in and they're not equal status, the contact is not going to diminish prejudices. In universities where, particularly universities that have very high academic standards, the criteria of status is how smart you are. At least at Princeton, that's a big thing. How smart are you? How good are you? How well did you do on your SATs? If you put people together who aren't of equal status, you get this sense that the whites and Asians look down on the blacks and Latinos as inferior to them, because in many ways, in terms of their academic performance, many of them are inferior. And similarly, the black and Latino students pick this up well, and they obviously feel that the white and Asians are looking down on them, and so you have exactly what Ward said. You have go into any cafeteria in any university that I've ever been to, certainly any of the higher end universities that I'm familiar with, and you will see segregated lunchrooms. The blacks sit with the blacks, the whites sit with blacks. When you see whites and blacks sitting together, in my experience, they tend to be people who are on the same sports teams, where they were equal status. You have meritocracy on the football team. It's pure meritocracy. You have pure meritocracy on the basketball team. What would happen if you had a basketball or a football team where the whites and Asians, being white or Asian, was counted as a big plus factor to make the team? I mean, just imagine how the black players would look down upon them as inferior, and would they be sitting together in the cafeteria? I don't think so. You would have the same sort of dynamic that you have now at the elite or the more competitive universities, where it's just much more difficult. You have to have much higher standards. You have to pass much higher standards to get in if you're Asian or white than if you do or you're black or Latino. I mean, it's just crazy. It's the worst kind of contact. It's contact that enhances prejudice, enhances discrimination. and reinforces the worst sort of negative stigmas and stereotypes about people who have been stereotyped in stigma all too long.
Ron Unz. Hallelujah. Ron Unz had a piece about meritocracy, and he commented on Asian American college admission disadvantage. Anybody want to comment on that?
Oh, well, one of the unintended consequences, I think, of the diversity argument and of trying, can you hear me now? Okay. One of the unintended consequences of the diversity arguments and the preferences given to race, and in effect, informal race balancing using holistic admission, has been the bouncing of Asian Americans in the admission process. And in the 80s, somebody on the admission committee at Princeton was one of those that went to the New York Times to complain about it. And again, it has a ripple effect. When we did the amicus brief for Fisher, one of the things we did look at informally was, since these are private universities, what percentage are Asian, okay? And the two comparable schools we looked at Caltech and we looked at MIT. MIT admits to having preferences. Caltech says they do not engage in race preferences. Caltech is 40% Asian. MIT is 27. That gives you an indicator. UNS has shown that the percentage of Asians taking the SAT has skyrocketed. The percentage of Asians applying to elite universities and being admitted hovers around 19%. And if there was no preference, you would have at least some increase in the percentage of Asians admitted, but that seems to be this very flat number that sort of varies by 1 or 2% among the Ivies and the elite universities in the U.S. News.
And the Ron Unz article that was referred to a long article in the American Conservative, I wrote a summary of it for Minding the Campus, the Manhattan Institute blog, and he shows very well just that Asians have become the new Jews. Just as Jews in the 1920s and 30s had ceiling quotas, that the Asians have ceiling quotas, and if the elite universities accepted Asians on the same terms that they accept whites, there would be like 40%, just as there is at Caltech. Caltech is the only elite university in the country that goes by strict meritocracy, or something pretty close to it. They have no legacy preferences. I think 2% of Caltech students are legacies. They do not give preferences for athletes. They're just interested in, are you a brilliant math, science, engineering student? Are you going to be a world-class mathematician, scientist, and other what they call STEM geek, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And the other elite universities would probably have about the same proportion. So instead of having 40%, though, nowadays, they'll have like 15%. So that's, not only UNS, but there was a very fine study by Tom Espen-Shade at Princeton, who's sort of a, you know Espen-Shade's book, and Espen-Shade is somebody on the moderate left. He's certainly not on the right, showing just the Asian disadvantage, the more, compared to whites, of course, compared to blacks and Latinos, it's much more. But it's much harder to get into elite universities if you're Asian than if you're white, and enormously harder than if you're black or Latino.
At the University of California, in the 9 campuses there, the percentage of Asians was about 22% prior to 2009. Now it's about 42%. And the reason is that they're taking the SATs and they're passing at higher marks than blacks and Hispanics. And I'm reminded of something that Ronald Reagan once said when he was governor of California. And he said, I don't care if every seat is occupied by an Asian, if they've earned the right to be there.
Isn't it amazing how little white resentment there is at the Asian advance, right?
No, there's Asian. There's white.
There's much less. There's the fact that they at Caltech, I find most white people who learn about Caltech, they say, yeah, that's how it should be.
I see resentment, but I see it from blacks and Hispanics.
Yeah, right. But,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree, but my experience anyway is that whites have not been resentful of the Asian advance because they know that the Asians got to where they are through performance. They didn't get it because of racial favoritism. Maybe your experience is different, but that with white people anyway, that's been my experience.
The real challenge that we face, those who are on the side of ending race preferences, is to try to win the argument about merit, because that is seen as an abstraction in many cases, and I don't know how, short of a national discussion about this issue, how we restore the focus of merit, individual merit, and in my view, that cannot coexist with the diversity rationale. Thank all of you for attending. Peter?